Adults, we appreciate your patience. I'm so sorry about having to cancel last week. It was one of those things where, man, sickness hit me really hard in the middle of the night, and I had desperately desired to still just push through and make it happen, but it became very clear that wasn't going to be the case, and certainly don't want to spread disease. And who am I going to call at 3 in the morning to say, hey, I need you to preach tomorrow? You know, like, I didn't think I was fair to anyone else, especially when we're on a passage like the one that we're on today. So sorry that we had to cancel last week, but we're back in action now. Happy to see you all. Happy to be healthy again. It's a joy to worship with you this morning. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 19. If you want to find that in your physical Bibles, again, there are handouts on the back table if you'd like to fill in one of those as we go as well. Genesis 19. So as many of you know, my wife and I have been together since we were teenagers. We go way back. And I remember pretty clearly one evening back when we were, 16, maybe 17, something like that. And we decided it would be a good night to have a movie night with my parents. Seems like a nice thing to do. And as you did back then, you go to the local video rental store to rent a movie, right? And you got to browse the shelves. Man, I really miss the days of Blockbuster and places like that, right? You got to browse the shelves, pick what you want. And we picked a movie that we thought would be good to watch with my parents. It was PG-13. It seemed very appropriate, very normal, nothing weird about it. Popular movie at the time, we'd never seen it. We go home, we put it in, we're watching the movie, sitting on couches in my parents' living room. And then a scene comes on that is sexual and graphic in a way. It's really unusual. If you wanted me to tell you after the service what movie it is and what scene I'm talking about, I'll tell you, but none of us knew what to do. We're all just sitting there, eyes on the TV, afraid to look at anyone else. It is so uncomfortable and so awkward that Kirsten and I both talking afterwards, we felt like we wanted to just sink into the couch all the way down into our graves. Like we would rather die than be there as this all played out, right? It was so uncomfortable because witnessing a bizarrely graphic sexual scene in mixed company is very weird and embarrassing and awkward. And that is precisely the feeling you're going to get today as we go into Genesis chapter 19 together. So you're welcome. You get to share in that feeling with us this morning. As you know, in our current series called Jehovah Jireh, which means the God who provides, we've been going through the life story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. And last time we were together, we saw as God appeared to Abraham once more. And this time, God visited Abraham appearing as a person along with 2 angels who also appeared as people. And after spending time with Abraham and reassuring him and Sarah that the birth of their son Isaac was coming, it would happen within a year, then God departs. He and his angels walk away, and Abram walks away as with them. Abram stops and has a conversation with God, as Brian mentioned in his prayer, where he pleads for the city of Sodom and Gomorrah that God is planning to destroy. But God has already made his decision. God knows the truth. There are no righteous people there, certainly not enough to save it. They are a people consumed by sin, known for their debauchery, and they are deserving of the punishment that is coming. So as we finished Genesis 18 last time together, the 2 angels had gone on ahead to Sodom while God stayed behind speaking to Abraham. And as we get into Genesis 19 today, we'll see the account of God's righteous judgment rightly coming down on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And as I believe we'll see today, we should understand that Genesis 19 exists as a warning. It is meant to help Abraham to see the contrast between these evil cities and the nation that God is calling to him to become. But even more than that, it is also a warning for us. It is a testament, as hard as it is to read, to the righteous wrath of God towards sin. Not just their sin, but our sin as well. It has served for thousands of years as a blaring alert, warning all who read and understand it of the deadly consequences of sin before our righteous and holy God. So as we go into Genesis chapter 19 this morning, yes, it can be a little uncomfortable. Yes, we will see God deal with sin, particularly sexual sin. Yes, it will be somewhat graphic and hard to imagine, but instead of just sinking back into your seat, wishing you could just be anywhere else but here, talking about anything else but this, instead, let it challenge you. Let it reveal your own sin. Let it move you to see the magnitude of the sin from which you were saved by Jesus Christ. Let it help you to see and be ever more grateful for a holy God who shows us mercy and grace and rescues us from our sin. So look with me at Genesis chapter 19, starting with verses 1 to 3. It says, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. They said, no, we will spend the night in the town square. But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. So again, as the angels that had departed from God and from Abraham arrived near Sodom, they immediately encounter Abraham's nephew Lot sometime in the evening. This is the same day that they had visited Abraham. And we should notice that Lot's response to these visitors is really very similar to the response that Abraham had to them. It is immediately recognizable to Lot that these are no ordinary men. They are visibly remarkable. They appear as men and yet somehow different, so much so that Lot's natural reaction is to run and bow down on his face before them and call them Lord or Master. He doesn't know what else to do. They are remarkable. They are different. They are obviously from God. So he bows before them and offers his hospitality to them. However, at his offer, the angels suggest that they'll simply stay the night in the town square. And like a true local, Lot is like, oh no, you do not want to be in downtown Sodom at night. He knows this. He knows what goes on. He knows his city well. And in fact, it seems indicated here that Lot is actually a trusted member of the community of Sodom. His home is inside the city walls, and he sits at the gate. The gate is where normally the town leaders would sit, and they would discuss judgment about different town issues and also serve as gatekeepers. And he's likely sitting with the leaders of the town of Sodom as one of them, like a gatekeeper. So Lot is not a true Sodomite. He's not from there. He is a transplant, as we call people here in Colorado, right? But he is also incorporated into the workings of this city. And this puts Lot in a bit of a precarious position. Because of his relation to Abraham, Lot knows of God. And for that reason, Lot is a confusing character for us. What are we supposed to do with this man living in a sinful city, but also being described like this in the New Testament? So in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 to 8, in the New Testament, Peter describes Lot saying this. It says, and if he, meaning God, rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. So in the New Testament, Peter's assessment of Lot is that he was a righteous man, and yet he lived within the city of Sodom. Probably because of his relation to Abraham, he knew of God. He knew of God's righteous standard. He knew that God calls people to something different. And in his righteous soul, he was tormented by the things that he saw and heard in the city. So for at least at some point in his life, Lot lived in Sodom and yet was uncomfortable being in Sodom. He didn't like what the culture was like. He knew that it was desperately sinful. And yet, Lot chooses to stay there, to build his life adjacent to this sinful culture. In fact, as you may recall in the previous chapters of Genesis, you remember, Lot chose to go down into the hill country near Sodom and Gomorrah. He first set up his tent and his family there, outside of the city. But here we see slowly over time, he's inched closer and closer until now he is incorporated into the city, living amongst them. And this is what we ought to see, something that we see in this story, but also reflected throughout the Bible and even in our own lives. The first point on your sheet is this. Sin, particularly sexual sin, is often very alluring and attractive. Lot was drawn in closer, even to what he knew was wrong. As we'll see in just a moment, Sodom is a place that is absolutely defined by sexual sin. It was their culture. It is who they were. And Lot could have built his life in the hills, but he didn't. He was drawn in, not to the point of participating in the sin himself necessarily, but simply being near to it, maybe even accepting it, maybe sometimes even publicly affirming it to avoid any kind of backlash. He was drawn in and allured by this type of sin. And we know this to be true for us as well. I don't have the verse on the screen, but James chapter 1, verse 19 uses this language about sin. It says that we are lured away and enticed by our sinful desires. That's what temptation does for us. We are lured like a fish to a piece of bait that we don't recognize as a hook that's going to kill us. Sin, particularly sexual sin, is alluring and attractive. It draws us in. This is one of the reasons that we want to offer something like the Armory, because we see a community full of people, especially men, who are involved in sexual sin through pornography, and we want to do something about that. They have fallen for something. They've been allured into something that is killing them. And even more than that, think about your own experience. You have also been pulled away, allured by these types of things. Think about this fact that is really troubling to me. Surveys show that upwards of 70% of pastors are involved in looking at pornography. Pastors. Like, how can that be? That's a huge percentage of people like me that are involved in looking at porn, when we're supposed to be the people who know what sexual sin is, knows it's a allure, and tries to avoid it. And it's not happening. Why is that? Because there's this particular allure and attractiveness of sexual sin. It can draw people away. We know this to be true. And in a way, that's sort of what has happened with Lot. Look back at the passage in Genesis chapter 19, verses 4 to 8. It says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, for I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Yuck. It appears that word has spread about these visitors, which again are visibly remarkable and different, and driven by perverse desires. Every single man in Sodom, both young and old, in an attempt to sexually assault them, come out and surround the house. They demand that their sexual desires be met. And make no mistake about it, they are there for rape. That's what they came to do. They are willing to beat down the door and become violent with Lot in order to get what they want. He's trying to protect his guests. They are given in completely to their lusts. And again, we do see that Lot has become kind of a part of this. There's a couple of ways that we could view Lot's reaction here. It is disgusting and strange for him to offer up his daughters, but I would say, understanding the situation, that he's probably acting out of fear in one of 2 ways. First of all, it could be that Lot is acting out of fear of the backlash of his community, right? They want something I'm not willing to give them, so I'll give them something else so I'm afraid of what they might do. He's so afraid of the backlash of his community that he offers up his own children to be sexually assaulted by these men. That seems disgusting, and yet, make no mistake, in our culture right now, there are plenty of parents who willfully offer up their children to a debased sexual ideology so that they avoid personal backlash from their culture. This still happens. Maybe not to this degree, but this still happens right now. So it could be out of fear of the community. Now, on the slightly more positive spin of things, we might say that this reaction from Lot is actually an expression of his fear of God. It's possible that Lot, fearing the holiness and the wrath of God, says, if these men have come from God, I have to protect them with everything that I have. And I know it's a very short description here, but it could be that Lot is saying anything but taking advantage of who God has sent. Even if I have to offer up my daughters, that's better than me sinning against God by giving up these angels to them. You see how that could possibly be the case as well? So maybe it's not quite as disgusting as it seems, but either way, this is not a God-ordained and approved reaction to the situation. It is a bad thing. He has offered up his daughters in order to give in to the culture that he lives in. Now it continues on in verses 9 to 11 saying this. But they, the men outside, said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and they drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands, meaning the angels reached out their hands, and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. The men of Sodom are insistent and persistent. They know what they want, and they are not going to stop. Even though Lot has proven himself to be more than accommodating, it's not enough. They even reveal here that they don't even view Lot as really being one of them. They say he's just a sojourner here, and now he's coming to judge us. And they're even willing to rate him worse than what they were planning to do to the angels. That's the threat that they make against them. And for that reason, the two angels have to reach out and physically pull Lot into the house, into safety, and shut the door behind them. And then they supernaturally strike all the men with blindness. And even as the men are blinded, they persist, groping for the door. Almost like mindless zombies, the men relentlessly pursue their perverse desire to sexually exploit these visitors. The whole situation, for reading this and imagining it together, this sounds insane. What could possibly be wrong with a person to make them act this way? And yet, maybe we shouldn't be all that surprised. We know from the Bible and from our own experience this true fact. The next link on your sheet is this, that sin, particularly sexual sin, corrupts our minds. It corrupts our minds. Remember the passage that we opened our service with today from Romans chapter 1. These men in this passage are consumed, as it said, with ungodly passions. They are given up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. God has, as it said, given them over to a debased mind. No, they are not thinking correctly. And yet they cannot and will not be convinced with reason or logic, or in this case, they're not even convinced with an actual act of God as they are struck blind for this behavior. They still persist. We see this kind of behavior also in our culture today. That's the power that sexual sin has over people. You see things that people are pushing, things that people are doing. You think, how in the world could they think that? For the person with a renewed mind who's been transformed by Christ, we see the sexual depravity of our own culture, and it literally, to me, it makes no sense. Like, how could you think that way? And yet we see this truth. The people are given over to a debased mind. The sexual sin corrupted their minds. They are not thinking clearly or rightly. They're given over to this. Now, all of this does raise a question for us that I think is important for us to address. And that question is, what is the sin of Sodom that gets the city destroyed? Now, the reason I say this is this. For thousands of years, everyone agreed that the sin of Sodom was homosexuality. It was exactly what we see described here. It was men desiring to have sex with, forcefully, male angels. We all understood this until about 70 years ago or so. As the sexual revolution took place in the West, Western theologians who were progressive in their readings of the Bible decided to say, no, it cannot be homosexuality that was the sin of Sodom that got the city destroyed. It must be something else. And so the prevailing argument among many progressive Bible scholars today is that the sin of Sodom was not homosexuality, but it was inhospitality. That's what they say. It was because they were inhospitable that the city was destroyed. Their claim is that in this culture and in their custom, this was not a fair way to treat guests. Lot should have brought them first to meet the elders of the city, and the elders should not have formed a mob. And furthermore, they claim that when it says that the men desired to know the angels, that word really just means that they wanted to get to know them, that they wanted to have a conversation, that they wanted to interview them in a way. But their insistence in the way that they did it was also poor etiquette and then thus inhospitality, which got their city destroyed. Now, in truth, I will say this. The Hebrew word in the text that is translated to know is yada, which does mean different things at different times. It can sometimes mean to get to know somebody. It can mean to have a conversation with them, to know them personally. But it also definitely means, especially early in Genesis, when Adam and Eve are put together, that they are to know one another in the marriage sexual relationship way. It means both things. Now, the reason that we would argue and say that this know means to have sexual relations and not just have a conversation is because that word is used again by Lot himself as he offers up his daughters. Would it make sense for Lot to say, here are my daughters who have never known a man. They've never had a conversation with a man before. They've never gotten to know any man before. Would that make sense at all? It's the same word. No, he's offering up his daughters because they are sexual virgins, not conversational virgins, right? So he's offering them up for this reason. He knows what the men want, and what the men want is sex. Some also claim that if it's not inhospitality that's the sin that destroyed Sodom, then maybe it's actually just the attempted rape. It wasn't that it was men that wanted to have sex with male angels. That's the sin. We can't call that a sin. We would never be able to say in our culture that that sort of a sexual relationship is wrong. So since we can't say that, maybe they just got destroyed because they wanted to do it forcefully against the consent of the angels. Maybe it's just rape that's the sin that got the city destroyed. So is that the answer? Well, no, we have to refer back to Genesis chapter 18. What did we discover in Genesis 18 as God conversed with Abraham? He had already decided that he was going to destroy these cities. He had known about their wickedness before. Before this incident, God knew that these cities were condemned. So it is not this incident in particular that leads to their destruction. Finally, others will sometimes argue that it's just general sinfulness. They were just generally wicked. It's not homosexuality specifically that is such an offense. Now, in a way, this is undoubtedly true to some degree, right? Because this is what we know. Usually, with one type of sin comes a lot of other sins. They go together. You get into a sinful lifestyle, and other sins suddenly seem more palatable because you're already taken to one. But this warning passage is very clearly and specifically in reference to the homosexual act. The Bible clearly and repeatedly categorizes homosexuality as sexual sin. Now understand this, we've talked about this before, but there does seem to be a specific biblical category of sexual sin. Again, it is alluring, it corrupts our minds, and it leads to a variety of other sins. And while it is the kind of thing that gets people very upset, we got to be honest here. The Bible clearly presents the idea that homosexuality is sexual sin. Now, I know this is risky, and I want you to understand, I'm not saying this in a hateful way. I'm only communicating what the Bible makes clear. I don't say that homosexuality is a sin in order to label or divide or exclude people, but saying otherwise would be dishonest and unfaithful to God's word. And here's the thing that we should understand. Even as I put this out there, even as the text places it plainly before us, this is what we understand. Yes, we say that homosexuality is sexual sin. But here's the thing. It's not the only sexual sin, and it's certainly not the only sin. And the point of this passage, more so than just being about this one thing, is that it shows us how seriously God deals with sin in general. You see, when it comes down to it, God's design, particularly for sexuality, is very specific. It is very, very specific in what we are supposed to do and what holiness is considered in sexuality. And for that reason, there's a wide variety of ways for us to sin sexually. Jesus goes as far to say that if a man looks upon another woman with lust, that he has committed adultery in his heart. And that is condemning, right? We understand those feelings. We have wandering eyes. We have fallen into the allure of different types of sexual sin. So when we talk about sexual sin in passages like this, we aren't being exclusionary, but entirely inclusive. Because what we understand is this: we have all fallen and failed in these ways. Sexual sin is pervasive in all of our culture, in all of who we are. And just because we haven't done exactly this doesn't mean that we don't stand guilty before God. Let's look back at the passage together. It says this in Genesis 19, verses 12 to 14. It says, "Then the men said to Lot, 'Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it.' So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, 'Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city.' But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting." Now here we see that the angels are adamant that Lot's family must get out of there. They know the destruction that is coming. And this passage for me brings to mind a New Testament passage, a verse that I feel like every Christian, especially every adult Christian, should memorize. It's only 4 words that you have to apply to your heart and say to yourself. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, this is what it says: "Flee from sexual immorality." Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Write this verse on your heart. Flee from sexual immorality. That's what the angels are pleading with Lot to do. Flee from this city, get your family, and get out. And I believe this is an important takeaway for us. The next blank on your sheet is that we should flee from sexual immorality. Rather than draw close to it, rather than dipping your toe into it, exploring it, entertaining it, trying things out to see what you might like, rather than slowly moving your family closer to Sodom like Lot did, what is the biblical wisdom? Flee from it. It is so toxic, so damaging, so alluring and consuming and corrupting that at the very sight or sign of sexual sin, our knee-jerk reaction should be to flee. Run. Get away from it. You don't want to find yourself in it. The risk is simply too great. Now, unfortunately, most of our world and our culture takes the attitude of Lot's sons-in-laws. As Lot tries to warn them and say, look, God is going to destroy the city. What has been done here is leading to destruction. And they just laugh it off. They think that he's joking. Our culture thinks that we're just naive, weak-minded prudes because we don't give in to a sexually driven culture. They think that we're a joke for this. They don't understand that it is wisdom from God that we flee from sexual sin. The sexual sin that sealed the penalty for Sodom and Gomorrah, which we see take place as it continues. Look at verses 15 to 22. It says, as morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest ye be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought him out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not just a little one? And my life will be saved. The angel said to him, Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. Now it should be remarkable to us just how much it takes to convince Lot to get out of there. Think about this. It's been all night. Hours of wicked men crawling around outside his door. Hours of the angels warning them and telling them to get out. And eventually, the angels basically have to drag Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters out of there by the hand. And even then, Lot doesn't trust where they are taking him to. He wants to go somewhere else. He's become a real city boy there in Sodom, and he's afraid to go up into the hill country. Instead, he wants to stay in a little nearby town. And they allow it. And up until the time of Moses, when this book was written, that town existed and was called Zoar, which means and translates to little one. So seemingly, against Lot's own will, God rescues him and his family. And in this story we see this morning, the next blank on the sheet is this. Sin deserves the wrath of God. And it is only by his mercy that we can be saved. It said it in the passage. This was mercy from God that Lot and his family were taken away. No, they weren't entirely deserving of this. It was God's mercy which saved them from the destruction that comes from sin. And I think you all know that this is Christianity 101. We are sinners in need of a Savior. We can't fix ourselves. We cannot repair what has been broken. Yes, we are sinners. Yes, our desires are wrong. Our desires are sinful. Yes, often our minds are corrupted by that sin. We are deserving of punishment and wrath. Whether we are guilty of the specific sins mentioned in Genesis 19 or not, we are still found to be guilty before a holy God. So before anybody gets too bent out of shape about me targeting and calling out homosexuality as a sin, as if it's greater than other sins, I'm not. Christians understand the truth that sin, all sin, deserves punishment and the wrath of God. Without the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ, I would be counted among the citizens of Sodom. That is the end that I deserve, is fiery wrath of God coming down from heaven upon me for my sin. You see, contrary to popular belief, Christians aren't out here only targeting the sins that we don't like. No, I preach against sin. Your sin, my sin, it all deserves the wrath of God. Whether it's homosexuality or dishonesty, whether it's fraud or lying, murder or gluttony or hate or drunkenness or theft or envy or pride or any form of dishonoring God in his holiness, it is sin, and sin deserves the wrath of God. And that's precisely what happens. Look at verses 23 to 29. It says, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar, and the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. The wrath of God comes down as fire, and instantly these cities are destroyed. It is total devastation. And interestingly, you might find it interesting that there is archaeological evidence of this actually having taken place. In an area of the Jordan, which you can see pictures of on the screen, called Tal El Hammam, they have found in their archaeological digs evidence of a civilization that was thriving and then suddenly stopped. It ended quickly. And not only that, but they found in the devastation charred rocks that are absolutely burnt to a crisp, and even pieces of pottery that were heated so quickly that they became glass. Something happened here. It is archaeologically verifiable. And some scientists, they're not going to say that they don't want to conclude that this is part of the biblical narrative, but what they do say is this: it must have been a meteor that came down and completely decimated this place. Okay. Is that not fire coming down from heaven by God? I mean, you describe it however you want. We see something happened here that burnt these places to a crisp. God did this. The destruction is thorough and final. All that is left is an ash heap and smoke going up into the sky, as Abraham saw. Well, that and a strange tower of salt, which was Lot's wife. Now, that's a hard thing to explain. I don't really have any other explanation except that the angels did say clearly, do not look back. And she looked back perhaps in sympathy for these people and was turned into a pillar of salt. Now, there are places right around the Dead Sea area there today where there are towers of what they say is salt, so a salt-like mineral. Towers there that they say, look, that's Lot's wife. Now, I don't necessarily know about that, but it is something that you could go and see. There's this tall tower of salt-like mineral there, if you want to see that one day. But either way, what we see here is this: the cities are laid waste. But there's one last bit of this chapter, and it might be equally disturbing as the rest. It's one of the reasons I feel like the Bible is true, because it feels like we could have skipped over this part and nobody had to know this, but they included this dark and dirty and nasty part because it's true, because this is what happened, this is what we know. I wouldn't have included it if it were about me, but here it is. Look at me at chapter 19, verses up to verse 38. It says, now when Lot went out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day, the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him. And he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son, called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Yuck, again. Well, there you have it. You can take the girls out of sexually depraved Sodom, but you can't take the sexually depraved Sodom out of the girls, I guess. It's awful and awkward and disgusting to read. Lot's daughters got him drunk and had sex with him without his knowledge, and they both get pregnant and give birth to sons. Those sons become nations that will also stand as enemies to the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. So even after the destruction of these sexually depraved cities, the depravity continues. It's abhorrent and it's disgusting. And again, all of this is meant to be a warning to us. This story highlights the deceitfulness of sin and the depths that people will sink to. It shows us the seriousness of the wrath of God towards that sin. And it shows us once again just how desperately we need God's mercy to save us. More than just trying our best to live differently than our sinful culture, we need God to rescue us by transforming our hearts and changing us from the inside. More than escaping from a burning city, we need rescue from God's rightful wrath towards sin. You see, we are deserving of the same fate as the men of Sodom. But the wrath of God was instead poured out on Jesus Christ for us. He suffered and died the death that all sinners deserve. And as we'll sing in just a moment, the sin of man and the wrath of God has been laid upon Jesus. The fire that came down to destroy these cities, that kind of wrath is what Jesus endured so that you could be rescued, so that you could be saved. So rather than reading a text like this and thinking about how awful those people are, how awful people like them are, let us instead see and understand, I'm like them. I am deserving as they are. I am a sinner deserving of the wrath of God, and I need his mercy to deliver me from the sin that corrupts my heart and my mind. So, instead of reading this verse with condemnation in our hearts, we should read it with thankfulness and turn to Christ, our salvation. Let's pray together as we finish for today. Now, the story is gross, and it should bring about in us a reaction of disgust. But God, help us to avoid the temptation of thinking of that disgust as being directed towards someone else when we know in our hearts that it should be directed towards us. God, help us to repent of our sins and trust in Jesus in faith, knowing that he has suffered fully the wrath that we deserve, the wrath that comes from you. God, help us to run to that old rugged cross where we find salvation, where your love was poured out over us instead of your wrath. Pray that you'll help us to believe these things, to know these things, and to trust in your mercy. In your name we pray.